Part 2. The House of Eorl. Eorl the Young was lord of the men of Eorl. That land lay near the sources of Anduin, between the furthest ranges of the Misty Mountains and the northernmost parts of Mirkwood. The Eorl had moved to those regions in the days of King Earl II, from lands in the vales of Anduin, between the Carrock and the Gladden, and they were in origin close akin to the Beornings and the men of the west eaves of the forest. The forefathers of Eorl claimed descent from kings of Rhovanion, whose realm lay beyond Mirkwood before the invasions of the Wainriders, and thus they accounted themselves kinsmen of the kings of Gondor, descended from Eldakar. They loved best the plains, and delighted in horses and in all feats of horsemanship. But there were many men in the middle vales of Anduin in those days, and moreover the shadow of Dol Guldur was lengthening. When, therefore, they heard of the overthrow of the Witch King, they sought more room in the north, and drove away the remnants of the people of Angmar on the east side of the mountains. But in the days of Leod, father of Eorl, they had grown to be a numerous people, and were again somewhat straitened in the land of their home. In the 2510th year of the Third Age, a new peril threatened Gondor. A great host of wild men from the northeast swept over Rhovanion, and coming down out of the Brownlands, crossed the Anduin on rafts. At the same time, by chance or design, the Orcs, who at that time before their war with the dwarves were in great strength, made a descent from the mountains. The invaders overran Calenathan, and Cirion, steward of Gondor, sent north for help, for there had been long friendship between the men of Anduin's Vale and the people of Gondor. But in the valley of the river men were now few and scattered, and slow to render such aid as they could. At last tidings came to Eorl of the need of Gondor, and late though it seemed, he set out with a great host of riders. Thus he came to the battle of the field of Celebrant, for that was the name of the green land that lay between Silverlode and Limelight. There the northern army of Gondor was in peril. Defeated in the wold, and cut off from the south, it had been driven across the Limelight, and was then suddenly assailed by the Orc host that pressed it towards the Anduin. All hope was lost when, unlooked for, the riders came out of the north and broke upon the rear of the enemy. Then the fortunes of battle were reversed, and the enemy was driven with slaughter over Limelight. Eorl led his men in pursuit, and so great was the fear that went before the horsemen of the north that the invaders of the world were also thrown into panic, and the riders hunted them over the plains of Calenathan. The people of that region had become few since the plague, and most of those that remained had been slaughtered by the savage Easterlings. Cirion, therefore, in reward for his aid, gave Calenathan, between Anduin and Isen, to Eorl and his people, and they sent north for their wives and children and their goods, and settled in that land. They named it anew the Mark of the Riders, and they called themselves the Eorlingers, but in Gondor their land was called Rohan, and its people the Rohirrim, that is, the Horse Lords. Thus Eorl became the first king of the Mark, and he chose for his dwelling a green hill before the feet of the White Mountains that were the south wall of his land. There the Rohirrim lived afterwards as free men, under their own kings and laws, but in perpetual alliance with Gondor. Many lords and warriors, and many fair and valiant women, are named in the songs of Rohan that still remember the north. Frumgar, they say, was the name of the chieftain who led his people to Eorl. Of his son, Thram, they tell that he slew Skartha, the great dragon of Ered Mithrin, and the land had peace from the long worms afterwards. Thus Fram won great wealth, but was at feud with the dwarves, who claimed the hoard of Skardr. Fram would not yield them a penny, and sent to them instead the teeth of Skardr made into a necklace, saying, "Jewels such as these you will not match in your treasures, for they are hard to come by." Some say that the dwarves slew Fram for this insult. There was no great love between Eotheod and the dwarves. Leod was the name of Eorl's father. He was a tamer of wild horses, for there were many at that time in the land. He captured a white foal, and it grew quickly to a horse strong and fair and proud. No man could tame it. When Leod dared to mount it, it bore him away, and at last threw him, and Leod's head struck a rock, and so he died. He was then only 42 years old, and his son was a youth of 16. Eorl vowed that he would avenge his father. He hunted long for the horse, and at last he caught sight of him, and his companions expected that he would try to come within bowshot and kill him. But when they drew near, Eorl stood up and called him in a loud voice, "Come hither, man's bane, and get a new name." To their wonder the horse looked towards Eorl, and came and stood before him, and Eorl said, "Felarof I name you. You loved your freedom, and I do not blame you for that, but now you owe me a great were-guild, and you shall surrender your freedom to me until your life's end." Then Eorl mounted him, and Felarof submitted, and Eorl rode him home without bit or bridle, and he rode him in like fashion ever after. The horse understood all that men said, though he would allow no man but Eorl to mount him. It was upon Felarof that Eorl rode to the field of Celebrant, for that horse proved as long-lived as men, and so were his descendants. They were the Mearas, who would bear no one but the king of the Mark or his sons until the time of Shadowfax. Men said of them that Bema, whom the elder called Orome, must have brought their sire from west over sea. Of the kings of the Mark between Eorl and Theoden, most is said of Helm Hammerhand. He was a grim man of great strength. There was at that time a man named Freke, who claimed descent from King Freowine, though he had, men said, much Dunlendish blood, and was dark-haired. He grew rich and powerful, having wide lands on either side of the Ardorn. Near its source he made himself a stronghold, and paid little heed to the king. Helm mistrusted him, but called him to his councils, and he came when it pleased him. To one of these councils Freke rode with many men, and he asked the hand of Helm's daughter for his son Wulf. But Helm said, "You have grown big since you were last here, but it is mostly fat, I guess." And men laughed at that, for Freke was wide in the belt. Then Freke fell in a rage, and reviled the king, and said this at the last, "Old kings that refuse a prophet's staff may fall on their knees." Helm answered, "Come, the marriage of your son is a trifle. Let Helm and Freke deal with it later. Meanwhile the king and his council have matters of moment to consider." When the council was over, Helm stood up, and laid his great hands on Freke's shoulder, saying, "The king does not permit brawls in his house, but men are freer outside." And he forced Freke to walk before him out from Eorl into the field. To Freke's men that came up he said, "Be off! We need no hearers. We are going to speak of a private matter alone. Go and talk to my men." And they looked, and saw that the king's men and his friends far outnumbered them, and they drew back. "Now, Dunlending," said the king, "you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. But you have said much already, and it is my turn to speak. Freke, your folly has grown with your belly. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust on him, he breaks it. So, with that, he smote Freke such a blow with his fist that he fell back stunned, and died soon after. Helm then proclaimed Freke's son and near kin the king's enemies, and they fled, for at once Helm sent many men riding to the west marches. 4 years later, in 2758, great troubles came to Rohan, and no help could be sent from Gondor, for 3 fleets of the corsairs attacked it, and there was war on all its coasts. At the same time, Rohan was again invaded from the east, and the Dunlendings, seeing their chance, came over the Isen and down from Isengard. It was soon known that Wulf was their leader. They were in great force, for they were joined by enemies of Gondor that landed in the mouths of Lefnui and Isen. The Rohirrim were defeated, and their land was overrun, and those who were not slain or enslaved fled to the dales of the mountains. Helm was driven back with great loss from the crossings of Isen, and took refuge in the Hornburg and the ravine behind, which was after known as Helm's Deep. There he was besieged. Wulf took Edoras, and sat in Meduseld, and called himself king. There Haleth, Helm's son, fell, last of all, defending the doors. Soon afterwards the long winter began, and Rohan lay under snow for nearly 5 months. Both the Rohirrim and their foes suffered grievously in the cold, and in the dearth that lasted longer. In Helm's Deep there was a great hunger after Yule, and being in despair against the king's counsel, Hama, his younger son, led men out on a sortie and foray, but they were lost in the snow. Helm grew fierce and gaunt for famine and grief, and the dread of him alone was worth many men in the defence of the Borg. He would go out by himself, clad in white, and stalk like a snow-troll into the camps of his enemies, and slay many men with his hands. It was believed that if he bore no weapon would bite on him. The Dunlendings said that if he could find no food, he ate men. That tale lasted long in Dunland. Helm had a great horn, and soon it was marked that before he sallied forth he would blow a blast upon it that echoed in the deep. And then so great a fear fell on his enemies that instead of gathering to take him or kill him, they fled away down the coombe. One night men heard the horn blowing, but Helm did not return. In the morning there came a sun-gleam, the first for long days, and they saw a white figure standing still on the dyke, alone, for none of the Dunlendings dared come near. There stood Helm, dead as a stone, but his knees were unbent. Yet men said that the horn was still heard at times in the deep, and the wraith of Helm would walk among the foes of Rohan, and kill men with fear. Soon after the winter broke. Then Felarof, son of Hild, Helm's sister, came down out of Dunharrow, to which many had fled, and with a small company of desperate men he surprised Wulf in Meduseld and slew him, and regained Edoras. There were great floods after the snows, and the Vale of Entwash became a vast fen. The eastern invaders perished or withdrew, and there came help at last from Gondor, by the roads both east and west of the mountains. Before the year 2759 was ended, the Dunlendings were driven out, even from Isengard, and then Felarof became king. Helm was brought from the Hornburg, and laid in the 9th mound. Ever after, the white cymbal-mune grew there most thickly, so that the mound seemed to be snow-clad. When Felarof died, a new line of mounds was begun. The Rohirrim were grievously reduced by war and dearth and loss of cattle and horses. and it was well that no great danger threatened them again for many years, for it was not until the time of King Folkwine that they recovered their former strength. It was at the crowning of Felarof that Saruman appeared, bringing gifts, and speaking great praise of the valour of the Rohirrim. All thought him a welcome guest. Soon after, he took up his abode in Isengard. For this, Beren, steward of Gondor, gave him leave, for Gondor still claimed Isengard as a fortress of its realm, and not part of Rohan. Beren also gave into Saruman's keeping the keys of Orthanc. That tower no enemy had been able to harm or to enter. In this way, Saruman began to behave as a lord of men. For at first he held Isengard as a lieutenant of the steward and warden of the tower. But Felarof was as glad as Beren to have this so, and to know that Isengard was in the hands of a strong friend. A friend he long seemed, and maybe, in the beginning, he was one in truth, though afterwards there was little doubt in men's minds that Saruman went to Isengard in hope to find the stone still there, and with the purpose of building up a power of his own. Certainly after the last White Council, in 2953, his designs towards Rohan, though he hid them, were evil. He then took Isengard for his own, and began to make it a place of guarded strength and fear, as though to rival the Barad-dûr. His friends and servants he drew then from all who hated Gondor and Rohan, whether men or other creatures more evil. The Kings of the Mark. First line. The first king was Eorl the Young. He was born in 2485. He was so named because he succeeded his father in youth, and remained yellow-haired and ruddy to the end of his days. These were shortened by a renewed attack of the Easterlings. Eorl fell in battle in the wold, and the first mound was raised. Felarof was laid there also. The second king was Brego, born 2512. He drove the enemy out of the wold, and Rohan was not attacked again for many years. In 2569 he completed the great hall of Meduseld. At the feast his son Baldur vowed that he would tread the paths of the dead, and did not return. Brego died of grief the next year. The third king, Aldor the Old, was born in 2544. He was Brego's second son. He became known as the Old since he lived to a great age, and was king for 75 years. In his time the Rohirrim increased, and drove out or subdued the last of the Dunlendish people that lingered east of Isen. Harrowdale and the other mountain valleys were settled. Of the next three kings little is said, for Rohan had peace and prospered in their time. The fourth king, Freya, was born in 2570. Eldest son, but fourth child of Aldor, he was already old when he became king. The fifth king was Freyawain, born 2594. The sixth, Goldwine, 2619. The seventh king, Deor, was born in 2644. In his time the Dunlendings raided often over the Isen. In 2710 they occupied the deserted ring of Isengard, and could not be dislodged. The eighth king, Gram, was born in 2668. The ninth king, Helm Hammerhand, was born in 2691. At the end of his reign, Rohan suffered great loss by invasion and the long winter. Helm and his sons Harleth and Harma perished. Felarof, Helm's sister son, became king. The second line. This line began with the 10th king, Felarof Hildason, born 2726. In his time, Saruman came to Isengard, from which the Dunlendings had been driven. The Rohirrim at first profited by his friendship in the days of dearth and weakness that followed. The 11th king, Britta, born 2752, was called by his people Leofa, for he was loved by all. He was open-handed and a help to all the needy. In his time there was war with the orcs that, driven from the north, sought refuges in the White Mountains. When he died it was thought that they had all been hunted out, but it was not so. The 12th king, Walda, born 2780, was king only 9 years. He was slain with all his companions when they were trapped by orcs, as they rode by mountain paths from Dunharrow. The 13th king, Folker, 2804, was a great hunter, but he vowed to chase no wild beast while there was an orc left in Rohan. When the last orc-hold was found and destroyed, he went to hunt the great boar of Everholt in the Fyrian wood. He died of the tusk wounds that it gave him. The 14th king was Folkwine, born 2830. When he became king, the Rohirrim had recovered their strength. He reconquered the West March, between Adorn and Isen, that Dunlendings had occupied. Rohan had received great help from Gondor in the evil days. When, therefore, he heard that the Haradrim were assailing Gondor with great strength, he sent many men to the help of the steward. He wished to lead them himself, but was dissuaded, and his twin sons, Falkred and Fastred, born 2858, went in his stead. They fell side by side in battle in Ithilien. Turin II of Gondor sent to Folkwine a rich weirgild of gold. The 15th king, Fengel, was born in 2870. He was the 3rd son and 4th child of Folkwine. He is not remembered with praise. He was greedy of food and of gold, and at strife with his marshals and with his children. Thengel, his 3rd child and only son, left Rohan when he came to manhood, and lived long in Gondor, and won honour in the service of Turgon. The 16th king, Thengel, was born in 2905. He took no wife until late, but in 2943 he wedded Morwen of Losanach in Gondor, though she was 17 years the younger. She bore him 3 children in Gondor, of whom Theoden II was his only son. When Fengel died, the Rohirrim recalled him, and he returned unwillingly. But he proved a good and a wise king, though the speech of Gondor was used in his house, and not all men thought that good. Morwen bore him 2 more daughters in Rohan, and the last, Theodwyn, was the fairest, though she came late, the child of his age. Her brother loved her dearly. It was soon after Thengel's return that Saruman declared himself Lord of Isengard, and began to give trouble to Rohan, encroaching on its borders and supporting its enemies. The 17th king was Theoden, born in 2948. He is called Theoden Ednil in the lore of Rohan, for he fell into a decline under the spells of Saruman, but was healed by Gandalf, and in the last year of his life arose and led his men to victory at the Hornburg, and soon after to the fields of Pelennor, the greatest battle of the age. He fell before the gates of Mundburg. For a while he rested in the land of his birth, among the dead kings of Gondor, but was brought back and laid in the 8th mound of his line at Edoras. Then a new line was begun. The 3rd line. In 2989, Theodwyn married Eormund of Eastfold, the chief marshal of the Mark. Her son, Eomer, was born in 2991, and her daughter, Eowyn, in 2995. At that time Sauron had arisen again, and the shadow of Mordor reached out to Rohan. Orcs began to raid in the eastern regions and slay or steal horses. Others also came down from the misty mountains, many being great Uruks in the service of Saruman, though it was long before that was suspected. Eormund's chief charge lay in the east marches, and he was a great lover of horses and hater of orcs. If news came of a raid, he would often ride against them in hot anger, unwarily and with few men. Thus it came about that he was slain in 3002, for he pursued a small band to the borders of the Emyn Muil, and was there surprised by a strong force that lay in wait in the rocks. Not long after, Theodwyn took sick and died, to the great grief of the king. Her children he took into his house, calling them son and daughter. He had only one child of his own, Theodred his son, then 24 years old, for the Queen Elfhild had died in childbirth, and Theoden did not wed again. Eomer and Eowyn grew up in Edoras, and saw the dark shadow fall on the hall of Theoden. Eomer was like his fathers before him, but Eowyn was slender and tall, with a grace and pride that came to her out of the south from Morwen of Losanach, whom the Rohirrim had called Steelsheen. The third line began with King Eomer Eodig. He was born in 2991. When still young, he became a marshal of the Mark, and was given his father's charge in the east marches. In the War of the Ring, Theodred fell in battle with Saruman at the crossings of Isen. Therefore, before he died on the fields of the Pelennor, Theoden named Eomer his heir, and called him king. In that day, Eowyn also won renown, for she fought in that battle, riding in disguise, and was known after in the Mark as the Lady of the Shield Arm. For her shield arm was broken by the mace of the Witch King, but he was brought to nothing. And thus the words of Glorfindel long before to King Earnor were fulfilled, that the Witch King would not fall by the hand of man. For it is said in the songs of the Mark, that in this deed Eowyn had the aid of Theoden's esquire, and that he also was not a man but a halfling out of a far country, though Eomer gave him honour in the Mark and the name of Holdwine. This Holdwine was none other than Meriadoc the Magnificent, who was master of Buckland. Eomer became a great king, and being young when he succeeded Theoden, he reigned for 65 years, longer than all their kings before him, save Aldor the Old. In the War of the Ring he made the friendship of King Elessar, and of Imrahil of Dol Amroth, and he rode often to Gondor. In the last year of the Third Age he wedded Lothiriel, daughter of Imrahil. Their son, Elfwine the Fair, ruled after him. In Eomer's day in the Mark, men had peace who wished for it, and the people increased both in the dales and the plains, and their horses multiplied. In Gondor the king Elessar now ruled, and in Arnor also. In all the lands of those realms of old he was king, save in Rohan only, for he renewed to Eomer the gift of Cirion, and Eomer took again the oath of Eorl. Often he fulfilled it, for though Sauron had passed, the hatreds and evils that he bred had not died, and the king of the west had many enemies to subdue before the white tree could grow in peace. And wherever King Elessar went with war, King Eomer went with him, and beyond the Sea of Rune, And on the far fields of the south the thunder of the cavalry of the Mark was heard, and the white horse upon green flew in many winds until Eomer grew old.